Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon Chapters 19 and 20. Exodus Rubble was a career hero. He was listed on official rankings but only ever on the published lists, not on those that were announced at the fancy events. He was currently at a career high of rank 682, which probably had something to do with the spate of shootings that had occurred. He spent most of his time at the emergency office, and sortied as a first responder when a call sounded like a hero would be needed rather than just a first responder. Far be it for him to take work from the paramedics. So that meant he usually went to fires, car crashes and other things like that. It wasn't hard work but it paid the bills, and since he wasn't usually fighting villains, it wasn't even particularly dangerous work. Being a hero was, if you picked the right role, pretty cushy, and Exodus intended to retire soon. He thought he could buy a small patch of land and run a market garden, or work in a convenience store. He'd need to do something but nothing strenuous. We got an alarm. He looked up from the magazine he was reading. Where from? Precept Building, the dispatcher who monitored all the alarm points responded after a moment. Exodus sighed. He didn't know the building, which meant he had to treat it as real. Not like the Acuity Building. They had alarms almost every second day when someone did something stupid. He put down the magazine and went to the dispatcher. What do we know? The woman was looking at the blinking lights on the panel as if they would tell her something more. They probably would. Alarm codes had been established a long time ago. They might even predate quirks, but it was all blinking lights to him. Looks like the building's sprinkler system got set off, she replied. Darn, that probably meant a fire. Exodus Rubble hated fires. It took forever to get the smoke smell out of his hair, and the ash got into his costume, and ugh. This one was probably a write-off already. Anything else? Building is occupied by Kai and the Precept Company. Don't know anything about them, the dispatcher said, this time referring to a book that was kept with information like that. It told them what hazards could reasonably be expected on site. No chemicals at least, she added brightly. He nodded and knew he couldn't dawdle further. Someone probably had a late-night ciggy and didn't put it out right when they left, he muttered. Probably, the dispatcher agreed. It happened sometimes. Late-night staff just needed the ciggies and didn't go to the smoking points. They triggered the smoke alarm or accidentally lit something on fire, which triggered the sprinklers, and then everyone had a bad night. Do you want backup? Another dispatcher asked. Exodus shook his head. Let me see what's happened first, he instructed. The alarm would have already gone to the fire brigade, so they'd be on their way too. He'd just get there faster, but he could call for more hero backup now if he thought he'd need it. I'll let you know who should be sent once I get there, he added. That got him a laugh. The dispatchers knew what he meant. They usually called it clean up or fark up. Clean up referring to crews who'd help dry out everything that the sprinklers had doused, and fark up mean the insurance because something worse had happened, though in practice, having your office space doused by sprinklers was pretty bad. I'm heading out, Exodus announced to the dispatchers. It got him a wave or two, but they'd already turned back to their screens. Yeah. He liked his cushy gig. Just stay calm, Yakuni said to Eri. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew something was. The 8 bullets were agitated and he hadn't seen Overhaul all day. So right at the moment, staying calm was the most important thing. He'd picked up that Kai was going to meet with Dragon to form an alliance. At least that's what it sounded like superficially, but Yakuni was used to listening to more than just the words. It wasn't an alliance Overhaul was seeking from Dragon. It was allegiance, with Dragon being the subservient. That wasn't going to happen, and for a while the back of Yakuni's throat had felt prickly until he managed to convince himself that for all of Overhaul's arrogance, he wouldn't just go to a meeting and demand to be obeyed. He'd lead into it. This would be the first of a couple of meetings, and Dragon would realize what was up and turn the tables at some point. Yakuni had remained convinced of that, until the 8 bullets agitation had turned into full frustration just after lunchtime. Then he'd realized that was actually what he should have been expecting. Dragon had walked away, and they were frustrated that things weren't going as quickly as they wanted. He'd believed that until their frustration had turned into paranoia a few hours later when Shin had returned. From the snatches of conversation he'd overheard, the meeting with Dragon had gone even worse than expected, and Overhaul had been Yakuni wasn't sure. Shin had garbled something about Kai being captured by the police, but Yakuni had no idea how that would even be possible. Kai wasn't just a run-of-the-mill villain. He would have used his quirk. It wouldn't matter how many police were there, Kai would have disassembled them all. Unless there was some serious hero firepower there. But Shin had not changed his mind, not even with Rappa and Rikia insisting that he was wrong. He'd also said that Mimic and Chronostasis had been captured. There'd been a moment, just a moment, when Yakuni had thought the 8 bullets might fight amongst themselves, but then Hikiji had said something and they'd calmed down. And believed Shin. Yakuni had taken heart from that. The meeting with Dragon had gone badly, and for whatever reason Kai had been taken by the police. He supposed it was possible that Kai had allowed himself to be taken in rather than give away secrets. After all, if the police couldn't prove anything, then they couldn't hold Kai forever. It might have been the most logical course of action. The explanation didn't feel right, but he couldn't come up with anything more unless the meeting had gone badly. If it had gone very badly, then could Dragon have simply taken Kai's quirk? That would explain why Overhaul had been taken in by the police. Without his quirk, he was just another man and the police could deal with him easily enough. By Dragon's dad, he hoped that was true. If it was, and the police didn't release Kai, then there was no way the 8 bullets could keep the Shie Hassaikai together. Especially if Mimic and Chronostasis were out of the way too. Even if the police released Kai. Without his quirk. Oh, what a potentially glorious day. Even Eri appeared to be pick up on the 8 bullets' agitation, though not the subtleties of it. What she knew is that without Overhaul there, they didn't do anything to her. He'd refined Kai's system so he didn't have to take Eri apart as often, and she definitely appreciated it, but Kai still insisted that most of the work be done when he was present. On days like today, it meant he had a lot of free time. Eri did pick up that something was very different when Shin ordered the other 8 bullets out to defensive positions. He picked up that they were expecting Dragon to raid them. Though if the boss had defeated Overhaul already then. Yakuni shut his eyes. Dragon wouldn't be raiding if he'd lost his quirk, so he hadn't hurt the boss. The prickle in the back of his throat returned and stayed. It was late when the radio crackled to life. What the hell are you RF? We're overrun. Arg. That wasn't the sound of defense. That was the sound of defense losing. Shin, who was still here with Hikiji, knew that as well. Yakuni saw Shin grab the radio. Toya, report. He ordered. Good choice. Toya would at least be calm in his report. I don't know which brat it is, but they have some sort of bioweapons, came the quick assessment. Yakuni didn't frown. He didn't need to draw attention to himself now, but what did Toya mean by which brat? Kai was meeting with Dragon, so wouldn't it be Dragon attacking now? The bioweapon bit was pretty easy to understand. They had to be the Nomu. Yakuni suppressed a smile. He might not understand everything, but if the Nomu were here then. He was leaving today. How many? Shin asked. Not sure. They just keep coming, Toya replied. He sounded distracted. Shin picked up on that as well and looked towards Hikiji. You heard? Hikiji nodded. Eri didn't like that. She cowered. Yakuni couldn't shake his head at that reaction. At least some of the intimidation from the Shie Hassaikai was because she responded. If she didn't, though, really that spoke to how weak the 8 bullets were that they had to get a response from a 7-year-old. Hikiji didn't say anything as he nodded. That seemed to be enough for Shin, who turned to them. You don't need to worry, the 8 bullet member said. Yakuni raised his eyebrow. It told the Shie Hassaikai member without words that he was doubtful of that. He wouldn't have done that to Kai, but Shin was an underling and right now he was too busy to attempt to exert his power. Plus he appeared to know they weren't in a great situation. I'll keep her safe, Yakuni reassured them. They'd think it was for Kai, but if Dragon was here then. He would be interested in Eri's quirk and so would Dragon's dad. He'd keep Eri safe until they'd seen her. You'd better, Hikiji growled. Yakuni kept his expression clear for the few moments it took for the Yakuza to turn away. He wanted to roll his eyes, but he knew better than to do that. There must have been something in his tone that no. There wasn't. Yakuni knew he hadn't given anything away. He'd had a lifetime of practice keeping his resentment out of his tone. When you were quirkless, you couldn't afford to let anyone know how you really felt. He had a quirk now, thanks to Dragon, but that type of thing never left you. Hikiji was stressed. That's all it was. The Shie Hassaikai were kind of directionless without Kai, and Hikiji was taking it out on him. Yakuni spent a few minutes reassuring himself of that while keeping an eye on the 2 8-bullet members who were here. They were definitely focused on what was going on in the building. Yakuni tried to think about what would happen. Dragon would raid the place and would eventually find here, and then the walls were reinforced, as was the floor and ceiling. He wasn't sure if the Nomu could break in. Dragon could probably compromise the air conditioning, but that would take time. They'd have to test their strength against the barrier Hikiji would put up. It would turn into a standoff, and Yakuni already knew Dragon wouldn't have the time to simply wait. The police, the heroes, someone would come, and the Shie Hassaikai would win by default because they could then later retrieve Kai. And if Dragon managed to get through Hikiji's barrier, then Shin would shoot him. Yakuni knew he had one of the guns loaded with a red, permanent bullet. Like hell that was going to happen. Yakuni looked down at Eri. "It will be okay," he whispered to her before he looked around. This room had always been sparse. There was the surgical chair that Kai put Eri in and some tables where he worked. The walls had some storage cupboards, but that was about it. He knew what was in those cupboards too. A microscope, and some surgical supplies, specifically syringes they used for extracting Eri's blood, and some gauze and bandages. Nothing immediately useful. But Shin and the other 8 bullets had brought in extra things. Yakuni looked at the tables, keeping an absent ear on the radio. It didn't sound like things were going well. There were a couple of temporary bullets on one of the tables, but no gun. Shin still had it, and while Yakuni was pretty sure he could overpower the 8-bullet, he couldn't do it while Hikiji was here. There had to be something. He looked up when there was an odd groan, but nothing changed. "Hey," Shin laughed. "What is it?" Hikiji demanded. "Some moron just set off the sprinklers," he informed the other 8-bullet. It took Hikiji a moment to work out the implications. Yakuni knew what it meant immediately. Dragon had even less time now. There had to be some way he could help. He could probably mix something up in a syringe, but they'd noticed that, so it was out. He ran through what he had in storage in the pocket he always carried with him. There was a heap of genetic samples from the Shie Hassaikai, including Eri. Some food, and he had a baseball bat. Yakuni smiled. He hadn't been able to get a gun, but the sports equipment was easy to come by. He'd been so focused on making sure the Shie Hassaikai never found out he had a quirk that he'd almost forgotten that. Carefully, Yakuni reached out, focusing on his quirk. He was not going to let Dragon be defeated by them. "Shin, I've got him alone." The report surprised the 8-bullets. "Then get him, Saramitsu," Shin commanded. For a moment Yakuni felt a stab of worry, then he dismissed it. Saramitsu would not be able to defeat Dragon. The 8-bullet member would be able to injure some of the lesser Nomu, but he couldn't defeat them. Not really. The call from Saramitsu was beneficial to him though. Shin and Hikiji were focused on the radio, as if they could somehow see how the battle was going. From the lack of reports, Yakuni knew it wasn't going in their favor. He suspected they knew it too, which meant he would have to act soon. Carefully, he reached into the dimensional pocket he carried, focusing on the bat. He felt his fingertips brush against the cold handle and grasped it, pulling it from the space quickly and putting it behind him. Eri gasped, but Yakuni managed to cover the noise by turning to comfort her. "Don't worry, it will be okay," he repeated. Yakuni couldn't quite bring himself to tell the lie that it was because Shin and Hikiji were there. He'd never been able to tell Eri the truth. He didn't think she'd betray him deliberately, but he didn't need Kai knowing that he wasn't loyal. She looked up at him, her red eyes full of questions. Yakuni smiled and nodded, to silently repeat his information. He saw Eri gulp and she returned his nod. "Just stay there," he instructed. She nodded again and sat where he indicated, before drawing her thin, bandaged legs to her chest and holding on to them. "Saramitsu?" Shin asked for an update, but the radio was silent. Hikiji shook his head. "He won't answer," the man said. Yakuni felt a surge of triumph at that. Izuku had obviously won, just as he knew he would. There was a thump and something echoed down the corridor. "Shit," Hikiji muttered and gestured towards the corridor. "What?" Shin demanded. "They found here," Hikiji reported. "Well, BL?" Shin didn't finish the order. "I already have," Hikiji interrupted. "No." Dragon didn't have the time to go through Hikiji's barrier. The 2 8-bullets focused on the corridor. Yakuni reached out and picked up the bat he'd gotten out earlier. He didn't give them time to react. The instant his hand closed on the bat's handle, Yakuni rushed towards Hikiji. The footsteps brought attention, but the 8 bullets didn't turn in time, and Yakuni snarled as he brought the bat down on Hikiji's head. Yakuni felt the reverberation in his arms, but he couldn't hesitate. Hijiki fell even as he was swinging towards Shin. This time, he hit the 8 bullets solidly on his side. Yakuni had put all his strength into it and heard a crack as Shin was thrown aside. That put him out of commission for a moment, and Yakuni took the time to look at Hikiji. The larger man was down and Yakuni quickly checked him over. He was out. Yakuni rose to check on Shin, absently flicking on the lights to the corridor. That should tell Dragon it was safe to come down. What? That was Shin. Yakuni looked down at him. His voice was soft and his arm was bent at an unnatural angle. He felt the pull of a quirk on him and realized it had to be Shin's. Yakuni didn't know much about the 8 bullet member except that Kai kind of trusted him. Why? He added the question breathily. Why? Yakuni repeated with an almost hysterical laugh. It was almost over. I was never loyal to you. He snarled, happy to be able to speak the truth. I was never loyal to the Shie Hassaikai or Kai or any of you. But. Shin swallowed. Kai checked. How? He demanded. Yakuni remembered that. He'd hurt for days afterwards. Your precious little overhaul assumed, he said fiercely. He assumed I was loyal to the old man, and I am loyal to Dragon first. And you know what the funniest thing is, he scoffed proudly. The old man knows it. He knew better than to make assumptions. He could have said more, but the first Nomu emerged into the room. If Eri had been a normal little girl, she would have screamed. Yakuni could see that she wanted to, but instead she just curled tighter into her little ball. Even though he'd seen pretty much all of the Nomu, there was something unsettling about seeing them outside of the tanks. They weren't loyal to him, the way they were loyal to Dragon, but he knew what would set them off. Yakuni took the few steps back to Eri, raising his hands as he slid down the wall next to her. It's safe, he yelled. Yakuni? Dragon didn't sound sure. It's me, Izuku, he called, using Dragon's name to show that it really was him. More Nomu came into the room, including several colored ones. They were more dangerous than the dun-colored ones. Then a man came in. He was wearing a skin-tight costume which covered him from head to toe. Yakuni didn't know who he was, and he didn't move when the man checked Shin and Hikiji. It's safe, he reported. In another time, Yakuni might have felt insulted that his word wasn't trusted, but since they were dealing with Dragon's safety, he was reassured that Izuku had sent someone to check. A moment later Dragon entered. He was wearing a full-face helmet, and a long coat over leathers, but Yakuni would recognize him anywhere. He actually felt himself relax. Dragon, he whispered. With Izuku here, at the very source of their operations, the Shie Hassaikai had truly lost. When Izuku heard Yakuni's voice he was relieved, but an old saying flashed through his mind. After victory, tighten your helmet. He could not just assume it was Yakuni. Instead, he motioned to the Nomu and sent them ahead, and before he could ask, twice went with them. That was nice, but he was going to have to make it clear to the man that maybe later. He did blame twice, but only a little. Jin didn't know what Kai Chizaki was going to do. The Nomu indicated that the enemies were down when Izuku walked forward and saw what the Nomu had been referring to. There were 2 of the Shie Hassaikai on the floor, and Yakuni was sitting against the wall next to a small girl. He cocked his head slightly at that. Why would the Shie Hassaikai have a child here? Mentally Izuku told the Nomu that Yakuni was safe. He knew they were on a time limit, but he couldn't help but be curious by what he could see. What is this? Izuku asked Yakuni, gesturing that he should get up. Yakuni gave him a look that Izuku had no trouble interpreting. It told him how patently unimpressed the young man was with the Shie Hassaikai. This is what passes for a lab for the Yakuza, he explained. Izuku looked around again. The room was pretty bare. There were several steel tables and what looked to be a surgical chair in here, and apart from a few cupboards, nothing else. This? Yes, this, Yakuni confirmed. For a moment Izuku was aghast, but then he remembered what he came for. Oh, everyone, this is Yakuni. He works for me, Izuku said, vaguely gesturing towards the young man. I'll do proper introductions once we are out of here, Izuku added before anyone could ask for further information. He turned back to Yakuni. Is this where the quirk erasing bullets are made? He demanded, trusting that Yakuni would know that much. The young man nodded. What about the cure? Yakuni nodded again. Where is it? Izuku demanded. That was what he had come here for, and that is what he should focus on. Do you know what color bullet? Yakuni asked. What difference does it make? Izuku returned his own question curiously. Some of them have time limits, came the explanation. The effects go away eventually. Idiot. The cry came from the floor. Izuku wasn't the only one surprised, but before he could say anything, the Nomu assigned to protect him was in front of him and he couldn't see anything. There was the sound of a scuffle and Izuku heard the crack of breaking bones before the Nomu moved again. The guy who'd spoken was still on the ground and his other arm was now broken. Twice was rather gingerly holding a gun. Despite the pain he had to be in, the guy laughed. It's not coming back. He spat. What do you mean, Shin? Yakuni demanded. She got hit with a red bullet, Shin explained. Izuku didn't know exactly what that meant except that Kai had a red bullet, but it appeared that Yakuni did. His face froze and then his expression turned sad. He bit his lip and looked over to him. If it was Red Dragon, then there's no serum. Exactly. The man identified as Shin laughed, but Izuku had picked up on something Yakuni said. He waved the others down. No serum? He questioned Yakuni. The young man nodded and moved to the wall, where he coaxed the girl up. She looked at them all with wide red eyes and Izuku felt as if he should take off his helmet to put her at ease, but he was still wary of the Shie Hassaikai here. Instead he cocked his head slightly to let that convey his question, since it was obvious that she had something to do with Yakuni's statement. The source of the Shie Hassaikai quirk erasure is Little Eri here, the young man told them, moving to stand behind the child with his hands on her shoulders. Can she reverse it? Mr. Compress asked. Izuku could tell he was trying to sound gentle, but he didn't quite make it. The little girl shook her head even as Yakuni nodded. Yakuni? Izuku asked, as he felt time slipping away. Eri can't control her quirk, the young man said before he looked straight at Izuku and mouthed, offer to help her, with exaggerated lip movements so that he could tell what was being said. So it's never coming back. Shin crowed triumphantly. Shut him up, Izuku ordered as he took the few steps required to approach Eri before knelt to face her. He was conscious that the Nomu moved with him, always staying between him and the Shie Hassaikai. He ignored the thump as someone did something to Shin. He'd check later if the Shie Hassaikai was alive. Is that right? You can't control your quirk? Izuku asked softly. Eri stared at him. He still had his helmet on and so Izuku could tell she wasn't sure about him. At this angle, Izuku could see Yakuni pat her shoulder comfortingly. It's okay, you can tell Dragon. He can help you, Yakuni said. He helped me. He added. That seemed to do the trick and Eri locked her eyes onto Izuku's helmet and nodded, before she sniffed. I hurt people with my quirk. You don't like your quirk? Izuku asked another question. Eri shook her head. Would you like me to help you? I've helped others, so has my dad. When someone can't control their quirk, I can use my quirk to help them, Izuku explained. Help me? Eri asked. I can use my quirk to take your quirk away, so that you can't hurt people. He said. It took a moment to sink in and as Izuku watched, he saw Eri's eyes widen as she realized what he was saying. She must be really scared of her quirk. You can help me? Eri whispered, and Izuku was shocked by the longing in her voice. He nodded. But I don't want to leave you quirkless, he told her, so what type of quirk would you like instead? He could tell the others were surprised. Dabi knew he could take and give quirks. They all did, but Izuku supposed, it was different seeing him do it. At that, Eri's eyes came the size of dinner plates and Izuku knew she had no idea how to answer. Yakuni had apparently thought about this though. How about Hikiji's? The young man suggested, leaning over slightly so that it was clear he was talking to Eri. He can make barriers, and if you have that quirk, no one could touch you, if you didn't want them to, Yakuni explained. The question highlighted the fact that Yakuni had definitely thought about it for a while and it seemed almost cruel to be manipulating the girl like this, but if her quirk could heal Himiko, then Izuku wanted it. The girl could probably learn to control it, but he wasn't sure he had the time for that to occur. This seemed like a reasonable trade. Hikiji's barrier quirk was strong and useful, so it would be something that Eri could use in the future if she was so inclined. Would you like that? Izuku asked, ignoring the way he could feel the others shifting behind him. You can do that? Twice Stage whispered. I can do that, Izuku confirmed. If Eri wants, he added, nodding his helmeted head towards her. You can do that? She asked breathlessly, repeating Twice's question. I really can, Izuku confirmed again. Please. He nodded. Let me get his quirk for you, Izuku said. He could just grab it from here, but it would be better to maintain the fiction he had to touch someone. Izuku rose and quickly went to the man who was still unconscious. He took off his gloves, making sure Eri could see that, and bent down to touch him briefly. Dragon's Horde rushed to grab the quirk, and under his mask Izuku huffed. There were times when his quirk seemed alive. He went back to Eri and squatted. Give me your hand, he said gently, holding out his own. Will it hurt? She asked tentatively. Not at all. Izuku reassured her, holding his hand steady. She reached out, and when she touched him, Izuku was surprised by how small her hand was. Again, he reached out with Dragon's Horde and gently tugged at her quirk. It came to him before he pushed the man's quirk towards her. Eri's red eyes widened as she felt the change in quirk. You can feel it? Izuku asked. She nodded solemnly. Good. You will have to practice hard with it, Izuku replied, putting his gloves back on, before he stood up again. We should go, he instructed everyone. They had what they needed now. He was sure Yakuni could tell him how to use her quirk. Izuku reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was slightly damp but still good. Outdoor battles, I think from now on, he muttered. That got him a chuckle from the others. Izuku noticed that Dabi at least had the good taste to look a little chagrined, but he didn't offer any explanation or apology. The expression at least proved it was Dabi who set off the alarm, but Izuku would have to ask later what had happened. He pulled up his location app and sent the text to Kurogiri. What happened to the other 8 bullets? Yakuni asked. He was going to a couple of the cupboards and pulling out a few vials. They were predominantly blue, but Izuku trusted that they had a purpose. Especially with the way Yakuni was putting them into his pocket. Izuku nodded to indicate it was okay to tell Yakuni. A big one is back there looking fried, Dabi answered nonchalantly. Before the others could speak, Izuku answered. They are all out there, he said. Yakuni looked thoughtful for a moment. You should get them, he suggested. I know you took out Kai, and he doesn't have his quirk, does he? He slipped the question in slyly. Izuku nodded. Yakuni grinned. Oh, what a great day. He celebrated for a moment before he became serious again. The 8 bullets are the Shie Hassaikai's main fighting force, and enforcers in their distribution network. They are also stupidly, suicidally loyal to Overhaul. If you leave them, there is a chance they will try to strike back. If you take them, and the heroes release Kai, then he will have the loyalty of the lesser Yakuza, but… Yakuni shrugged. Overhaul would have to make up for the power difference somehow. Plus, I might be able to make a high-end Nomu with Rapper. Yakuni continued. Izuku wasn't sure what he thought of that, but it was a sound suggestion. He bit the inside of his lip. It had been easy to make those who had attacked Ochako into Nomu because they had attacked her personally. Most of the 8 bullets hadn't attacked Himiko. Only Overhaul had, and no. He couldn't think like that. The 8 bullets supported Overhaul. The only reason they hadn't attacked Himiko was that they weren't there. They would have. They could have, and they enabled Overhaul to do it. They weren't equally guilty, but they weren't innocent. He nodded, and ordered 5 of the Nomu to go back and search the building for the bodies. They could bring them back and Yakuni could get to work. They had a lot of work to do in the near future. They were on a time limit, but so far nothing appeared to be disrupting them, and all he needed was the time to get away. 2 of the Nomu picked up the Shie Hassaikai there. Kurogiri appeared and looked around. His yellow eyes lingered on the child. Mr. Tanahito, the Misty Man, greeted Yakuni. It was interesting to see that with the greeting, Izuku's companions relaxed slightly. He realized they'd been tense around Yakuni despite his familiarity with the young man. Kurogiri, Yakuni greeted the warp gate. It's been some time, the Misty Man replied. Yeah, Yakuni agreed, and the next time the doctor asks me to do something, I am going to tell him to stuff it, he said amiably. Kurogiri only nodded, while Twice and Dabi both sniggered. Did you get what you came for, Dragon? The Misty Man asked him. Izuku was surprised. This was the first time Kurogiri had called him dragon. It made him feel. He wasn't sure, but it was something noteworthy. He shook his head. I got all that I'm going to get, Izuku replied. For a moment Kurogiri just stared before giving him one nod and expanding. No. The high-pitched squeal took Izuku by surprise. He looked down and was somewhat amused to see Eri clinging to Yakuni's leg like a limpet. You can't leave me, she yelled. Yakuni looked around frantically and Izuku could tell that the others were laughing at him. Then he turned to Izuku and the expression on his face was easy to read. Izuku looked at the girl. Her long hair was shaking as she cried into Yakuni's leg. For a moment he wondered if they should just take her, and then reality set in. They did not have the time, or resources to care for a young child. Especially not one who had been with the Shie Hassaikai. He honestly didn't know how his father had done it. Eri, Izuku said, squatting again. He motioned to Kurogiri to start taking everyone out of here. The warp gate nodded at him and then expanded. It was almost comical how fast Dabi and Twice went through him. They did not want to deal with the child. Eri, Izuku called again when she didn't look at him. The second call did the trick and one red eye revealed itself from behind Yakuni's leg. It was brimming with tears. He tilted his helmet slightly in what he hoped was a comforting way. Eri, if you come with us, you will be called a villain, Izuku told her. The red eye he could see widened and he could see her fear and confusion. But you. She didn't finish. I helped you, but the world says I'm a villain, he drove home the point. So you have to go? He could hear the trembling in her voice as she asked. We have to go, Izuku confirmed. You don't want to be called a villain, do you? But Yakuni? Yakuni too, Izuku emphasized. He was suddenly thankful for his helmet. He could see that Eri believed him, and while she knew they'd helped her, she had the automatic childlike aversion to bad things like villains. It was almost stupidly easy to manipulate her, and his dad could have done this to him. He could have made him into a villain so easily. He could have just told him the things he wanted to hear. But Dad had let him make his own observations and make his own choices. The outcome was the same, but if Dad had just removed the gentle narrative of his youth and told him the truth immediately, then the result was obvious. Dad would have told him in such a way that villainy was heroism and heroism was villainy. He had sort of anyway, but he'd done it in a way where Izuku could see what the rest of the world thought, and understand why they thought that way. He'd been careful, and the burst of gratitude he felt was unexpected. You'll be okay, Izuku told Eri. No one will be able to touch you now, and there is someone coming who can help you. He added. A hero would have been dispatched, and in this, taking care of a little girl found in an obviously bad situation, the hero would take care of it. It was good publicity. What they wouldn't do is take on the difficult issues, the things that would truly make society as a whole better. Dad had raised him to see that. He'd raised Tomura to ignore that. A lot of things made sense now. All you need to do is wait and tell the people who come that Dragon helped you, Izuku said. Dragon helped me? Eri asked, sounding confused. I'm Dragon, he reminded her. Eri pulled back from Yakuni's leg a little and he could see her blink the tears away. Yakuni didn't press her to release him completely, even as the first of the Nomu came back carrying what was left of the Shie Hassaikai, who appeared to eat the Nomu. Whisper had dealt with him. Don't look, Izuku murmured, shifting slightly to block the view. Just tell the person who comes that Dragon helped you, and they'll do the rest, he said. But Izuku hesitated for a moment before he made up his mind. He pulled one glove off, and formed a single scale which he pulled loose. If they don't help you, use this, he said, offering her the scale. Internally, Izuku sighed. Tomura would have just walked away. He didn't have any responsibility for her, and swapping her quirk for the barrier one was a fair deal, but Dad had raised him to see the issues with society, and people leaving everything to heroes was one of them. He had to at least try to be better than that. Eri reached out to take the scale. How do I use it? She asked. Under his helmet, Izuku grinned. You'll figure it out, he told her confidently. Those scales, his mark, were only going to become more valuable in the future. It should be easy for her to use. As Izuku watched, Eri swallowed, and nodded and released Yakuni's leg. The young man knew better than to sigh. Instead he turned around and squatted too. You are going to be fine, he reassured Eri. The people coming will probably do some tests, but they just want to find out how healthy you are. And after that, there won't be any tests," he said. She actually brightened at that news. "But we have to go now," Yakuni said. "Can't you stay?" He shook his head. "You don't want to be a villain," Yakuni repeated Izuku's line, before he reached out and gently ruffled her hair. "You will be fine," he said as he rose. Izuku rose as well and motioned more of the Nomu through Kurogiri as another Nomu returned with a body. It went through Kurogiri without hesitating, leaving a trail of wet footprints all the way up to the warp gate. "Are we ready?" Izuku asked Whisper and Mr. Compress. He got nods from them both and indicated they should go through Kurogiri first. Yakuni had taken Eri to one of the tables and lifted her so that she was sitting on it. "They'll be here soon," he reassured her before he turned away. Izuku looked at his face. It was resolute, but before Izuku could make a note to ask if Yakuni was okay with this, his expression shifted to relieved, answering his question. While the young man might have a bond with the girl, he knew what was best for her. "Go," Izuku instructed. "I'll wait for the rest of the Nomu," he said as he turned to the dark corridor. Kurogiri gave him a nod and Izuku felt most of the Nomu, Yakuni, Whisper and Mr. Compress pass through Kurogiri. "You should have gone," the warp gate murmured. Izuku shook his head. "I have to see this through," he indicated. Yellow eyes stared at him before Kurogiri reformed at his side. The Nomu guarding him accepted his presence. "It shouldn't take long," Izuku assured him. "You father always said that," the misty man murmured. Izuku knew it was ironic and underneath his helmet he grinned. Maybe this time, it would be true. End. The Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon, Chapters 19 and 20. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Join me for the next chapters. Or check out my other works.